Hello everyone. As many of you may know, I have recently acquired myself a BMW M3 track car. Now I've done one track day with that car already. I've got another one booked up for this month, and I have 3 more booked up for the rest of the year already. I am trying to take my promise to myself and to you guys to use that car properly very, very seriously. Now, to aid in my adventures with that car, I have decided to build myself a little sim racing rig. Now, this is the sort of thing that previously I've often thought about doing, but it's not cheap doing this properly. Anyone that's done that will tell you so. And I've had, racing wheels and stuff for cars and computer games and things for ages, but I tried using some of them recently with a few more modern simulator games, and they were just awful. I then decided to take it seriously and say, okay, for the amount of money that I'd spend on doing a few track days, I can buy a decent sim rig which is going to last a very long time and allow me to get a lot of practice in. So if I do eventually decide to go somewhere like the Nürburgring, I'm not going to be a total idiot, because I'm going to at least know where the track goes, and knowing where tracks go is a very, very key part of having a good time, and putting in a good lap time is nothing to do with it. I'm not about going fast on track days. I'm about enjoying myself, and if you know what's up next, you're not going to be afraid, and you are going to enjoy yourself that much more. However, in building this rig, I have become somewhat nostalgic and started thinking about some of the racing games that I started to play when I was younger. Now, I'm just shy of my 30th birthday, and so I grew up with the 1990s racing games. And in the 90s, we really did see things go from pretty crappy kind of basic graphics, stuff not serious at all, to very serious hardcore simulators. I remember playing games in the early 90s like Virtua Racer. Remember that? It was on the Sega Mega Drive, and it was actually a 3D racing game, which for the time was really quite rare and quite unusual. Now, I also then had things like Jeff Cramman's Grand Prix on the computer, and they went up to Grand Prix 4, I think, in the end, and those were actually seen as quite detailed and accurate simulator games, although I was kind of into F1 at the time, but I've never really been that big into F1 games for various reasons. I got into Gran Turismo. I had all the Gran Turismo games from 1 to 5 or so. I haven't had the recent ones because I got into Forza Motorsport. But I started thinking about how much my car tastes have been influenced by these computer games. And so I present to you now my short list of 5 cars which I think, for me, and if you're of a similar generation, perhaps for you as well, cars that maybe you've really admired or been after and kind of wanted thanks to these video games. Now, I had a couple of criteria here. The main one being they must be real cars. There's loads and loads of cars in loads of video games that are totally fictional. They're still super badass, half the cars in Ridge Racer, all those sorts of things, but they don't exist. So you can't really buy something that doesn't exist. Other honorable mentions. So I'm going to give a massive honorable mention to the Toyota Supra, in particular the Castrol Tom's Supra, and it very, very nearly made it into the list, but didn't quite. So I'm going to start my list off with a car that I think people might remember, because if you wanted to just not quite cheat in a game, but you wanted to just get the fastest, quickest, meanest, craziest spec thing, that was the car you wanted. Now, it made its debut in Gran Turismo 2, and I'm talking about the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak Edition. Now, the Suzuki Escudo is a fairly humble, small 4x4 thing. We had it in the UK. We called it the Vitara. My mother actually had a Suzuki Vitara for about 2 weeks before someone kindly wrote it off for her one day. The Pikes Peak version of this car, I'm not sure, bears any resemblance beyond the name to the actual car. Now, the real-world Pikes Peak thing is actually quite similar to what appears in the game. There was a lot of cars in the game. One was the Gillet Vertigo, which was also a car I nearly mentioned in this list, because without the game, I would never have even known that it existed. But the specs of the Vertigo were very, very unlike the real car. So the Pikes Peak Escudo, however, In the game, it had nearly 1,000 horsepower out the box, weighed under 1,000 kilo, and had insane aero, just like the real thing. If you wanted to win races really easy, you just got yourself one of these, because this thing was absolutely mad. I mean, crazy, bonkers car. Yeah, what a thing. And the minute I would have said it, I bet a lot of you would have gone, oh, yeah, I remember that. And the rest of you will be going, a Suzuki? What? Go look it up. It's incredible. There's videos of it going up Pikes Peak. It was designed to basically hammer Pikes Peak in the mid-90s, and it did exactly that. It's awesome bit of kit. Next up on my list is a car which had an entire video game dedicated to it. Now, there have in the past been a few video games where one particular brand has featured perhaps solely, I mean, I'm sure many of us remember a Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed in about 2000 or so. It very heavily featured the then new Boxster and other Porsche products. So, but this game was in the arcade, and I also had a copy on the Dreamcast, and it's the Ferrari F355 Challenge. Now, that's an iconic car, a brilliant car that I have actually, unlike many of the other cars on my list, I have actually been able to drive a 355 on a couple of occasions. And the intro the game had, which is laughably standard by today's graphics and standards, of these cars outside the Ferrari factory, are just, it's called soul-stirring stuff if you were kind of like a 11-year-old like I was when the game was fairly new. And I remember the arcade machines because they had one with triple displays in it, which is such a cool thing back then. And it was a very hard game as well. I mean, I did play an arcade version of it recently on a ferry, but the machine itself was absolutely knackered, so I couldn't really tell you how accurate the game really was. But that cemented my love for a car which I already had a serious lust for. Now, the next car that I'm going to talk about was not just the cover car in its own game, but was the villain too. I'm of course talking about the BMW M3 GTR that starred in Need for Speed Most Wanted. This was driven by the bad guy in the game, whose name I completely forget because it isn't important. None of us remember, do we? What we all remember is that sick car that he had, and that car's going to make a return soon because they are doing a new Most Wanted game, which is what reminded me of this really super cool modified car. Now, the M3 GTR is in of itself a really unusual and cool car. And you've got to remember, for people like me, before we had, always on internet and Wikipedia and things like that, these car games were how we learned about many cars that we then fell in love with. And that's really important when it comes to, forming lusts and things. For children of the 70s and 80s, it was more like, what car did you read about in Road and Track? What was your bedroom poster car? What car did people drive? What film stars, had cars, stuff in movies, the Trans Am and Smokey and the Bandit, stuff like that. Those what influenced you. For people like myself, it was the cars that were in video games that were just as important as anything else. And I'm then going to go back to the first video game featuring cars in a serious way that I remember playing. I had the special edition version of Need for Speed. And that cemented my love for a particular Lamborghini. I still really badly want a Diablo. I've only seen about 3 of them in my entire life. I've only ever sat in one Lamborghini, and I have absolutely never driven one. I'm hoping this year I might be able to change that, but let's see what the year holds. And the final car in my list, and this isn't really a sort of ordered list, but I think this is maybe the most significant car for a few reasons. This car, I'm not even singling out a particular version of this car, and that's why I think it's so special. I'm talking about the Nissan Skyline GTR. for me, my ideal GTR is the R34 GTR in Bayside Blue, please. But the reason that I think the GTR is so important is not only was it a great, brilliant car, but in those early Gran Turismo games, they were very, very Japanese in sort of everything that they did. I mean, the way they're designed, the way they're styled, the tracks that they used, and most importantly, the cars that they featured. The early games, they were like, 70, 80% Japanese metal. And because of that, that's how many people of my generation got our knowledge and our love for all this JDM goodness. And one of the things that they did to kind of pad the car out, pad the games out rather than just have, one version of each car, they'd have all the different versions. So, when you're talking to people like me and you say, oh, I've got a Skyline GTR V-Spec 2 Nur, that actually means something. I remember that car from that game. And that's what that game really taught me, was how many different versions of the car are. We knew what the R32 was, what the R33 was, what the R34 was, all the different editions, all the different versions, the racing versions of these cars, So I remember that amazing yellow Pennzoil liveried car, like just all these different things. And they're such a cool looking car. And also, the R34 is one of those rare cars that when I was about 10, I thought was the coolest, sexiest, most amazing looking thing ever. And 30-year-old me basically is going to agree with 10-year-old me on that one. That's pretty cool. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief little video talking about a few iconic cars from my childhood playing video games. I would love to know what you've loved thanks to video games. Tell me in the comment section below, and I'll see you very soon for some more actual driving. And when this rig is done, which is going to take a little while, I'll be happy to tell you all about that too. Bye.